Jeff, I normally would ask you about Thursday Night Football, but I'm not even going to go there.
Oh, thank you very much.
Because after the amount of time that you and I spent a few weeks ago watching the release of the four-part ESPN 30 for 30 Once Upon a Time in Queens,
I've watched it twice.
I know
Just
you
so-
have.
I know.
And that's only because you haven't had more free time.
That's
you
right.
would have watched it more if you had a little more time on your hands. Who better to have on come and talk about it with us? Producer, director Nick Davis joins us to talk about it all. Nick, thanks so much for giving us a few minutes today.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Nick, I got to thank you. As somebody I was in college, I was a freshman in college, the 1986 year, and that documentary brings back so many memories of that time. And I know you're a Mets fan. What was it like for you to do that and to go through that and live that with the actual players?
It was a dream. I mean, I can't. I was just actually thinking, and we didn't have time for it in the film, but I went down to Philadelphia. I'm a huge Mets fan, and I was, I guess, a junior in college. And I went down to Philadelphia to see the Mets clinch in September, and they did. They got swept by the Phillies. And it was just such an incredible time to be a fan of a team that had been so bad for so long, and then came together, piece by piece in the early 80s until by 86 they were this juggernaut. And it was such a thrill for me then. And so to be, I just can't put into words what it's like to then, 35 years later to be able to tell their story. It was a dream.
So it's one thing to be a fan and get to watch it. It's another thing to get to tell the story. But not only did you tell the story, you got the league's blessing, and that translated into sort of the most comprehensive collection of video footage and archival material that we've seen about the team. Can you talk about that process and how that added to what you were able to do in telling this story?
Well, the league, luckily enough, if this had been about the 85 Mets, if the 85 Mets had broken through and won a World Series, we wouldn't have had nearly the archive that we got for 86. For some reason, the Mets had a documentary film crew that intermittently followed the team that year. It wasn't major, it wasn't every day, but it was enough to give us some behind-the-scenes footage that most people had never seen before. And in particular, when you get to the playoffs and World Series, it gave us some shots that were just, magical. I think, what's great about Major League Baseball at this point with this kind of film is they exercised no editorial control. They were like, look, we trust that you're not out to get us. You're not out to get these guys. These guys obviously had a lot of personal problems that they are, willing to discuss and display, but you're going to tell the whole complete story and from start to finish. And so it was just fantastic to have them as a partner because in addition to also just being able to get every Met game that was recorded and all the radio broadcasts from that year, they just had a tremendous archive. And for some reason, there was a major jump up in 86 in all of their archives.
Well, is that because they were also great recording artists in 86?
Exactly. Yes. Rap stars, you haven't heard songs like that since,
we talked with Ed Hearn last week about his starring role in that 1986 Mets video, so we made sure to get that story. You mentioned something, though, about the players being willing to talk. They didn't seem reluctant when participating at all. Were you surprised how open some of these players were with you? And can you talk about what the interview process was like?
Yeah, I think some of them were a little reluctant initially because, look, this is a story that's been told in bits and pieces in other documentaries and certainly in books and articles, but no one had ever approached it from, the era of the long-form documentary where we had 4 hours to tell the whole story. And I think some of them thought, oh, you're just out to get us again. And as soon as we sat down and started talking to them, I think they realized, oh, wait a minute, this guy's actually asking us, about our whole lives, not just zeroing in on, so what was it like doing cocaine in New York, or any of the sort of gotcha kind of things. So I think they all felt like, all right, they're going to do this right. And I was surprised at how open they all were. I think those who, maybe haven't had the best lives wanted to tell their stories in kind of a cautionary tale kind of way, like don't do what I did. Certainly Doc Gooden and Darryl Strawberry, I think, want to get their stories out there and feel like people can learn from some of their mistakes. And I think to some extent the same is true of Lenny Dykstra, who has not had the easiest time. But then, like Keith Hernandez, I was completely surprised that he went so deep into his very complicated relationship with his father. And he could have painted it in much, broader strokes. And he could have also just said, I'm not going to even try and explain how complicated it was with my dad, who I loved but had this complicated relationship with. So yeah, it was wonderful to talk to them all and be the sort of recipient of so much openness.
We've talked to athletes in the past about, we even talked to people like Tim Tebow about the parent-child relationship growing up in sports. And then you have this story, which I really wasn't expecting, was this story about Keith Hernandez and his father and the way that his father was calling him after every at bat, and that apparently Keith Hernandez's biggest regret was that he got his dad a dish. Was that something that you knew going into it, or was that something that because he starts to feel comfortable, he starts to divulge this information and just share?
Well, a little of both. I mean, Keith wrote a really good autobiography, or a portion of an autobiography, mostly just about his early struggles up until his years with the Cardinals a couple of years ago. And a lot of his relationship with his father is in there. But there's something about it in print that's just different from actually having him talk to you or talk to an audience, because you feel it on an emotional level in a different way. And he did, I think, go into greater detail with us than he did in his own book. I mean, it was mutual. I mean, Keith is going back to Davy Johnson's office and calling his dad. The problem is that his dad was sometimes saying, I told you before, you close your stance, or whatever it is. And they really got into it, so much so that they had a huge fight in the summer of '86 and didn't talk all summer. And that was actually from a Sports Illustrated article I read the summer of '86, late that summer. A great piece by, I think, William Hawk is the sports writer's name. And it was in that piece that he said that he hadn't been talking to his dad all summer. That wasn't in the book, but I asked him about it because of that article.
All right. Well, I do have to ask one more question about Keith Hernandez. What was up with the cat?
His cat's great. I mean, the cat is, I guess, people knew that he had this cat, and so we started the interview in his condo in Florida outside on a little, patio or whatever, and the boats in the harbor behind him, and then actually a lawnmower was just too loud. So we went inside, and that's where the cat had been. And the cat just immediately jumped up and was on his lap, and a few of the people on set were like, well, what can we do with the cat? And it was clear, like, Keith was comfortable with the cat there. So we just said, well, let's just roll and we'll see what happens. And it couldn't have gone better. I was very, very happy with Haji's participation.
So unlike you and Jeff, I wasn't the Mets fan growing up, but the '86 World Series is sort of my first real memory of baseball playoffs and that intensity of watching the game with my dad. How was it for you to capture the way that Game 6 went in that series and to relive it with the players? What was that like?
What was most fun, if I don't know if fun is the right word, but was to play for Mookie Wilson the audio, and we just listened in the interview room as we listened to the entire at bat with Mookie Wilson, listening to the radio call from Bob Murphy, and that to me was just a very, very special moment. And only a couple of seconds made it into the film, but it was really, you felt like, wow, it did change all their lives. Like Bobby Ojeda says, like, it was just a moment, but it changed all their lives, and they all remember it so vividly and so well, and so happily. And it's great to have those moments that, I mean, obviously Red Sox fans and people who were not rooting for the Mets remember it negatively. But even it's not a serious negativity. It's not a national tragedy. But to have a moment where we can all remember where we were, and it's so emblazoned in our memories, it's just really fun. And it was great to hear it from all those guys.
Yeah, I have to tell you, that at bat and the way that you covered that game from beginning to end, it's edge of your seat to the point. I'm always amazed that people who are good at documentaries can take something that we all already know the facts. It's not like a fiction movie where you don't know the ending. We know what the ending is, and as you're watching it, you almost forget and don't want to know the ending as you're watching it. Mm. What was it like for you to, you know what the ending is, but to cover it that way and cover every pitch and what everybody was thinking, and even the players leading up to that and all the chaos that was going on? What was it like to go through? We all lived that moment. You're now sitting there with them going through their recollections of every second of that.
Kevin Mitchell coming up was the thing that stunned me.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, first of all. And I have to give a shout out to the editor of that episode, Josh Freed, who did a fantastic job of weaving all those stories together. It was so fun. I mean, it was, and it was so great that we got to hear from all of them, and they all remembered it so specifically. A lot of athletes' memories are faulty, but in that inning, they all remembered it perfectly. They just nailed it exactly down to the, well, then I fouled it off, and then I knew he was going to throw me the slider, and I was waiting for the slider. And, all that stuff was just so fun and terrific.
So towards the end of episode 4, you have Doc Gooden talking about watching the parade from a drug house, which, that I wasn't as familiar with that story, and it's compelling to watch and hear him recount it. One, what was that like for you? And then two, were there other stories that you came across that you found particularly compelling throughout this?
Yeah, that was heartbreaking. And as a Mets fan, I remember that he missed the parade and that the New York Times reported the next day that he'd missed it because he had the sniffles. And we all
he did,
knew.
apparently.
Exactly.
And nowadays that would be an excuse now.
Right. Exactly. No, I mean, it was, I went into the interview knowing, okay, this will be a moment we have to get to. What I didn't know we were going to get to in so much, and to answer the second part of your question, like the trauma that Dwight Gooden went through in his childhood was a complete surprise to me. As Met fans, we knew Darryl Strawberry came from a bad background. Dwight Gooden came from a good background. In the sort of broad strokes as a fan, that's what we were told in the 80s. And he had a middle-class family, and his father and mother came to the games, and you just felt like, okay, Darryl, haunted, troubled, great talent, but it's going to be difficult. Dwight, angel, perfect. This is going to be amazing. And so to hear the trauma and that his mother shot his father at one point because Dwight had accidentally let her know about an affair that his father was having. I mean, that's like, Greek tragedy kind of stuff. Thankfully, he lived, the father lived, and they stayed married. But, I had no idea the depth of the trauma that Dwight Gooden went through in his childhood. That was completely news to me. And there's more. I mean, there's actually another story that we didn't have time for of him being in a house where his sister gets shot in the head when he's like 6 years old. And it's just like stunning. Now, we didn't have time for all those things. And I should say we're lucky enough to have this oral history, this book that came out that sort of contains a lot of the stories that we just didn't have time for in the film. But yeah, I mean, to get back to your point, I mean, there were so many moving stories that these guys told that it was just what made them great in the 80s was not just how talented they were, but they were so compelling as personalities, and the same remains true today. Even if you didn't like them in the 80s, you couldn't deny that they were captivating. You couldn't avoid the 86 Mets. And the same is true now. These are really interesting people, and interesting characters is what makes for an interesting documentary.
You mentioned that you didn't have time to tell the story. There must be so many things that are sitting on the cutting room floor. Of all of those things that we didn't get to see, what do you think is the one that you most say, I wish I could hear that, or I wish I would have put that in there.
Well, it's funny because I hadn't thought about this. The other story from Dwight's childhood really is traumatizing, and it's not like I wish we'd put it in because it's like how many traumas can you put in one man's childhood? But there's a great, really intense story that Ray Knight told that I kind of wish we'd had time for, but it is thankfully in the companion book, and they're in St. Louis, and it's a hot day, and Gary Carter is outside signing autographs because that's what Gary Carter does. And the rest of the team is on the bus. And Strawberry is getting angrier and angrier. And he leans his head out the window and he says, "Hey, Camera Carter, get your butt in here. And come on." And he starts yelling at Carter. And Carter gets on the bus and he's furious. And he starts storming towards the back of the bus where Strawberry is. And Strawberry comes storming towards the front of the bus. And Ray Knight stands up in the middle of them and sticks his hands out and stops the two of them and says, "Hey, we're not going to fight each other." And to me, that story said so much about his leadership and their attitude and their toughness and the fact that they knew they fought and they're going to fight everyone else. They're not going to fight each other. So I wish we'd had time for that story, but I've told you now.
Yeah, and Nick, if you have a couple more minutes, the other thing that I just want to discuss is, one, the companion piece. So we have this book, Once Upon a Time in Queens, and it is so great. I don't know whose idea it was to put this out with this, but it's incredible. How do you have time to do that, the documentary, and you have another new book?
Well, I know. So I, from the minute I was able to get this project off the ground, I was saying to them, this has to be a book. We have to have a companion book. We're going to have so many stories. Let's do it. So thankfully, because we're having transcribers and everything, it was a lot of work to pull it together, especially because the publication or the due date for the manuscript was before we'd edited the 4th episode. So it was very hard, especially for the later chapters. And it's why the later chapters, frankly, are a little fuller than the early chapters. Even so, everything contains many stories that we just weren't able to fit in the film. And I also, years ago, started a companion book about a documentary about my grandfather, Herman Mankiewicz, and his brother, Joe Mankiewicz. And the companion book is called Competing with Idiots, Herman and Joe Mankiewicz, a dual portrait. And it took me 19 years to write, in part because there was no film. So there was going to be this documentary film. This was going to be a companion book. The film went away, and I was left with a book contract that I had to fulfill. And I'm enormously proud and pleased that I did. And I don't know how I did it all. I did it all because I had to do these two things. You can't walk away from a book about your family, and you have to do this project about your favorite team of all time. I can sleep later.
Well, what do you do after this? You cover one of the most interesting teams in baseball history, and then you cover your family, which also covers one of the most interesting periods, because for people who don't know, your grandfather was the screenwriter of Citizen Kane. So
yeah.
What do you do next? How do you top it?
I've got another film that I'm just starting to get off the ground that I'm really excited about. Nothing will ever be as sort of pressure packed as these two because I cared so deeply about them going into it. But on the other hand, I think that I'm not worried about that. I think it'll be fun and it'll be a little easier I've made films about things I knew nothing about, and that can be a lot of fun. This one, the one I'd like to get off the ground, I can't talk about it, but it would be really fun, and it has to do with sports, and I'll come back and talk about it.
Yeah, I was going to say,
able to complete it.
When you get that one off the ground, we hope you'll come back and give us a little time. We really appreciate, first of all, the work that you did, because we've enjoyed watching it, Jeff, more than me, of course. But second, for giving us a little time to talk about it today. Thanks so much.
Oh, well, thank you, guys. This was fun.
You have a great one, man.